Thank you so much for joining us today. So this will be actually the first webinar of one of the Girls Human Rights Hub summer programs for the advocacy program specifically. We are really happy to have you joining us for this important learning journey where we will explore today how advocacy can advance girls' human rights across the globe. So today's topic specifically is Foundations of Advocacy and Ethics, and we are really happy to be joined by our speaker, Georgiana Epure, a dedicated human rights and gender equality activist. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Alexandra. I'm a volunteer within the Girls Human Rights Hub, and I'll be moderating today's session. And I'll be also helped by Bianca, who's also a volunteer.
Yes, it's nice to meet you, everyone. I'm really looking forward to this session and overall to the advocacy program. I hope you will like the whole project, and I'm here to support you along the way.
And now I'll quickly introduce Georgiana. So Georgiana Epure is a human rights and gender equality activist whose work is located at the intersection of local and international levels. Her work currently focuses on protecting and advancing sexual and reproductive health and rights in Central and Eastern Europe. Previously, she worked on global advocacy to end child marriage, international human rights strategic litigation, and also led gender equality initiatives in Romania. And in fact, in recognition of her impact, Georgiana was honored with the 2024 Girls Human Rights Hub Trailblazer Award for Leadership. So we'll begin with a talk from Georgiana. We're really honored to have here today, then followed by an interactive exercise, and in between a little Q&A. So, firstly, Georgiana will have her presentation. Feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A option that you can see below on your screen. Ask questions throughout, and we'll have a dedicated time for those questions right after the presentation. Yeah, so Georgiana, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here again with us today.
Thank you so much, Alexandra and Bianca, for the introduction. And hello, everyone. It's really nice to be spending the next 1 hour and a half together this afternoon. This is the third time I am speaking. I mean, I have this speaking role with the Girls Human Rights Hub program, but it's the first time that I'm doing it online. So it's a first for me, and I hope that the presentation I prepared is going to keep you engaged and interested, because the art and science of advocacy is a topic that is engaging and interesting. I'm going to see if I can share my screen, and I would love it if you can tell me if it works. Let's see. How about now? Okay, since I'm loading.
Yes, it's working.
That's great. So for this first session on advocacy, I thought that it would be best to go through the fundamental elements of an advocacy campaign by looking at a specific example. Because advocacy is not so much about theory as it is about doing. And the example I chose is a recent successful advocacy campaign I led in Romania, my home country, with an NGO that I have been volunteering with since I was in high school. It's called the Association for Liberty and Equality of Gender. And the name of this campaign is Employers for Respect. It sought to improve legislation regarding harassment in the world of work and protection of workers. So I'm going to walk you through some of the elements and moments of this campaign and use examples of the tactics and objectives and how we have managed to keep nimble in a very dynamic political context in order to successfully achieve our objective, which was for Romania to ratify the first international treaty that enshrined freedom from harassment in the workplace in international law. It's a dedicated treaty that was adopted by the International Labour Organization. I started this project at the end of 2019. And for the next 4 years, 4 to 5 years, it really became something that I became a little bit obsessed with, because it was always evolving, the political context, how authorities were responding and engaging with us and our demands and so on. And it was always on my mind, this International Labour Organization Convention number 190. It's abbreviated as C190. This is how you're going to see it on my screen. Is the International Labour Organization Convention on Violence and Harassment. I was thinking about it when I was on holiday skiing. I was thinking about it when I was in my honeymoon in Iceland. I was thinking about it all the time, because all of the actors that we were engaging with were responding to our demands and our letters, our articles in the media at a time when it was convenient for them. And it did not matter that the team that I was working with was not in the office or working constantly on this. And this is one of the first lessons that is to be learned, that it's so important to be nimble in your advocacy work. You think you have a timeline to work with, but it's not the timeline that you envision, it's the timeline that the decision makers dictate most of the times. The problem that my team and I identified was the fact that harassment in the world of work was disproportionately affecting young women, including girls, actually, because when you're thinking about interns and volunteers, many times we're talking about minors and adolescents. And there was a very prominent gender aspect to harassment in the world of work. The Association for Liberty and Equality of Gender, that the organization I was working with, has a service whereby it provides psychological counseling and guidance for women and girls that experience gender-based violence. And there were numerous instances in which young women and adolescents and older women were coming to us to talk about how they were experiencing harassment in the world of work. And while listening to their stories, it didn't take long for us to understand that really to contest harassment in the workplace in Romania, as in many other countries and on context, can quickly become a radical act. Why a radical act? Because it means to contest specific relations of power, of inequality in power relations in the workplace. When you are contesting it outside by going to authorities, it was often the case that the authorities were having all sorts of informal understandings with the employers, which hinder them to do their job effectively, and sanction employers. So it was really a radical act in the sense that you weren't just contesting harassment, you were contesting injustices at the different levels within the workplace and outside of the workplace. So one of the first things that we had to do in our advocacy work was to really put this issue on the public agenda, to make it an issue that it's not just women's rights organizations that care about, but it's the general public, it's other interest groups, and especially unions. So the organizations that represent workers. And this is what we started doing in 2019. I was an alumna of a similar program to what the Girls Human Rights Hub has been doing in the last couple of years. I was an alumna of a Young Leaders program led by another organization, Women Deliver, and I won a small grant. And with that grant, my team and I decided to create the foundations for this advocacy campaign to improve anti-harassment legislation in Romania. And this is how we started. We actually started in the local council in my hometown, where we invited decision makers from my hometown, as well as representatives of various employers, be them from public or private sector, to talk to them about the importance of having internal policy at the company level or institutional level that would address this issue of harassment when it happens and before it happens, with a huge emphasis on prevention. While we were doing the research for this meeting, we learned that just earlier that year, in 2019, the International Labour Organization had adopted this landmark convention on violence and harassment, which was negotiated by over 190 governments, as well as representatives of workers from those states, as well as representatives of employers for those states. The International Labour Organization works as a tripartite body where you have government representatives, workers representatives, and employers representatives. And over the course of several years, they negotiated the language of this convention, and in 2009 they voted to adopt this convention. The government of Romania, like the government of the UK and many other governments, had voted in favor for this convention to be adopted, but it did not ratify it. The ratification of a treaty is a process through which a government is giving its consent for the provisions of that treaty to become legally binding for it. So what Romania did was to say, we agree with what this convention says, and we want the International Labour Organization to adopt it, but we're not going to do anything else. So what we said is like, you cannot just say that you agree with the provisions of the treaty and vote in favor of its adoption and stop there. You also have to implement those provisions, and those provisions have to be legally binding for the state. So this was really the crux of our campaign. We were campaigning for Romania to ratify this convention because we knew that once ratification happened, this would trigger an entire legislative process domestically, whereby the state would have to amend its laws in order to be in line with the provisions of the International Labour Organization Convention on Violence and Harassment. So what is this convention? I'm going to give you a very quick overview of what it's about. It is enshrining a commonly agreed definition of violence and harassment in the world of work. So this is the minimum the language of this definition was negotiated over years by many actors, and this is the common ground they found, that violence and harassment in the world of work refers to a range of unacceptable behaviors and practices or threats thereof, where a single occurrence or repeated occurrences aim at, result in, or are likely to result in 4 types of harm: physical, psychological, sexual, or economic. And this includes gender-based violence and harassment. And then the convention goes on and defines what gender-based violence and harassment is, which is violence and harassment directed at persons because of their sex or gender, or it's violence or harassment that affects persons of a particular sex or gender disproportionately, and this includes sexual harassment. It was very important for the convention to have a paragraph specifically dedicated to gender-based violence and harassment, and then from that definition to flow a series of provisions that would make protections for workers and obligations for employers under this convention to be gender sensitive. The convention goes on and defines workers to include interns, volunteers, people who are job seeking. It goes beyond workers in the formal economy to also include workers in the informal economy. So it has a very broad definition of what workers means, which means that it has a very broad scope of applications. And then it goes on to define what employers are under the convention. And it also offers a very broad definition to cover not only formal employers, but also informal employers. Those actors or persons who may not be a former employer, but they act as an employer through the responsibilities or authority that they may have over a worker, be that a formal or informal worker, so someone with a contract or not with a contract, with a work contract. As you have probably noticed, I use a lot the concept of world of work rather than the workplace, and this was something intentional that the drafters of the convention insisted on, again, to broaden the scope of where protections for workers would apply. It's not just in the office, but according to the convention, it's on the way to the office, especially if transport is organized by employers, in accommodation provided by employers, in social settings that is organized by employers. The world of work also covers telecommunications and WhatsApp messages between workers, colleagues, and so on. So the convention was trying to really encompass all sorts of behaviors in all sorts of instances that may amount to harassment and violence. The convention and its accompanying recommendation that was also adopted by the international labor organizations insist on the need for the state and employers to adopt an inclusive, integrated, and gender-sensitive approach to harassment and violence in the world of work. Inclusive, meaning to not let anyone behind. That's why they include informal workers, for example, migrant workers. There are specific provisions dedicated to that. Integrating, meaning that it's not just about sanctioning harassment, it's not just about reporting harassment, but it's also about prevention and raising awareness about harassment. And gender sensitive, to really take into account how harassment and violence in the world of work may disproportionately affect workers because of their sex or gender. They also call for the government and employers to identify the sectors and workers with the highest risk of harassment, so that resources, which are always limited, can be directed there first. In many countries, for example, feminized industries like the garment industry or the service provision or the caring industry, where we see a disproportionate number of female workers, but with positions of management actually being occupied by male workers. In many instances, this creates a context whereby these sectors have a higher risk of harassment. Other sectors, for example, would be in occupations or industries that require working during the night. Or that require working with clients. So it's not because there is a risk not only to be harassed by your peers, but also by third persons, such as customers or clients or patients or so on. In a rather novel move, the convention insists on the need for governments and employers to address the impact of domestic violence on the world of work, recognizing that oftentimes survivors of domestic violence, when they go to work, doesn't mean that they are any more safer. And there in Romania, in this country as well, there have been many instances where domestic violence has traveled from home to the workplace, posing a threat not only to the victim of domestic violence, but also her colleagues. So we did a lot of research about what the convention entails. And then in order to make our case, we looked at what the Romanian legislative framework said. To what extent it aligned with the convention provisions. And we already had an idea of what this comparison would reveal, but it was very important for us to have it researched and put it in a study that clearly articulated the limits of the legislative framework and why it's important that laws and policies are improved. We found that there were very narrow definitions of harassment, whereby harassment in the Romanian legislation was seen purely through a lens of discrimination. You may remember the definition that I read at the very beginning. There was nothing in there that suggested that harassment happens only when you are discriminated against on the basis of a particular criterion of identity. It may happen that you are harassed as a result of discrimination, but you can also be harassed just because someone doesn't like you or they feel threatened by you, or other reasons that may not fall within the legal definition of what discrimination legally means. Other limitations included narrow definitions of workers. So the Romanian legislative framework, for example, excluded informal workers, narrow definitions of workplace. There was no recognition of third-party harassment. So what happens when it is what protections there are for you as a worker if you are harassed by the customers that you have, by the patients that you have, by the passengers you have, if you are a taxi driver or a bus driver, and so on. Interestingly, harassment was not seen as an occupational health and safety issue. It was seen as a discrimination issue, which meant that employers, when they had to go through their occupational health and safety protocols, did not have to take into account violence and harassment in the world of work. So it was very important for us to highlight that and then work with authorities to change that. There was no acknowledgement of the impact of domestic violence in the world of work, and in terms of policies, there was no monitoring of how the existing anti-harassment legislation was being applied by employers or not applied. There was no training for various officers handling harassment cases that were reported to the labor inspectorates or to the courts, for example. And there were some problematic judicial practice issues, whereby although the law did not say that harassment has to happen over the course of a particular time in order for it to legally count as harassment, in some court decision, there was this new element added to the definition that it had to happen over the course of at least 6 months, which is not what the lawmakers had intended when they had adopted the anti-harassment legislation. There was no data of how the evolution of harassment in the world of work, about this evolution. So we didn't know whether it's decreasing or increasing. The latest comprehensive study had been made in 2006, before Romania joined the European Union. And there was a lack of workers, lack of awareness regarding their existing rights, and no support for employers, also for them to know how to better come to respond to the needs of workers when they report harassment or to prevent harassment. Luckily, the convention and the recommendation of the International Labour Organization came with solutions for all of these. So this is what we asked. We asked for the ratification of the convention and for all of these gaps to be bridged. You have here the covers, they are in Romanian, of 2 of our studies, policy briefs, where we analyze the convention standards and the limits of the current legislative framework, having very specific recommendations for the government, for the parliament, for employers, and for trade unions representatives. In 2021, we launched our first study at a conference with many relevant stakeholders. And then later on, 2 years later, we launched another study that specifically looked at the harassment of migrant workers in Romania and the particular needs and protection needs that they require, given that they don't speak the Romanian language maybe, and there are other hurdles for them to pass. So another important lesson for an advocacy campaign is to really know what you're asking and know it well. So it's very important to do your research and become an expert in the issue that you are trying to solve. Know what the problem is in detail and what the solution you are proposing and how it fits within all the policy and legislative frameworks and how things work in practice. So I would say that at least the very beginning of this campaign, and in general for a campaign, it's a lot of unseen work of research, desk research, speaking with authorities. We had sent inquiries to all of the labor inspectorates in Romania, 42 of them, to understand the situation, how they react when they receive a complaint. We spoke with the police, we looked at judicial decisions, we spoke with workers, we spoke with trade unions, we spoke with employers, so we can really understand the issue in detail. Then what we needed to understand is how to ensure that the solution we are proposing, the ratification of the convention, is going to have buy-in from the government. We wanted the government, the Ministry of Labor, to push for the government to ratify this convention. And we had sent many letters, we tried to engage with them, we tried to engage with parliamentarians as well, and we didn't receive the engagement that we needed. So we went back to the basics and we were asking ourselves, how do these people that have the power to change things work? If they're not listening to us, who are they listening to? Oftentimes when we're thinking about people's power, we think about it in this way, like a pyramid, whereby the decision maker is at the top and they give an order and then it trickles down everywhere. But what happens when the decision maker at the top, in this case, the Minister of Health, doesn't listen to your demands? We turn it around. We literally turned it around and we looked at the fact that actually the Minister of Labor, I think I misnamed the minister before, it's the Minister of Labor, is the key decision maker, of course. But in order for that person to lead that ministry and to make the decisions, actually, to be in power, it's prompted by many other actors. So we started thinking, who are the actors that are keeping the minister in that position and that the minister is listening to? If they're not listening to civil society, who is he, in that case, it was a he, listening to? So we saw that there is a body in Romania called the Economic and Social Council that reunites representatives from employers, workers, and civil society that has to give an opinion for every law that is passed by government or parliament. And in addition to that, it can propose its own recommendations for improving the law. So what did we do? We went to this council and we said, we want you to recommend the government to ratify the convention. Then we looked that there is a National Council to Combat Discrimination. Again, we went to them and we said, we want you to use your authority and recommend the government to ratify the convention. There is an ombudsperson. Again, an institution that is specifically designed for respecting human rights. We went with the same request. We went to the National Agency for Equality Between Men and Women. We went to the Labor Committee and other committees in Parliament and so many other institutions. And to all of them, we asked them to use their tools and their voice to press the Minister of Health to ratify the convention. And this pressure came in the form of various opinions and reports and letters. So we started to galvanize a lot of support and to make this ask, this demand being asked not just by civil society, but by all these other institutions that had a say in policy making, and that the Ministry of Health was legally obliged to at least have a dialogue with them. And this culminated, started to gain momentum. We started to have some hearings in the parliament with the Labour Committee. We had lots of bilaterals with all of these institutions, and there was this added pressure for the ministry to take action. We really mapped our targets. This is another important element in the foundational element in an advocacy campaign, to know who you're targeting. Who do you need to convince to come on board? Or who do you need to make sure that they're not going to work against you as much as they could? And in our case, we knew that if we wanted the government to ratify the convention, we needed to get on board the unions, other civil society organizations, not just those that work on women's rights, because harassment is not just a women's rights issue. We wanted to have the Labour and the Human Rights Commission in the Parliament be on our side, national human rights institutions, and so on. And of course, the public opinion. We wanted this to become an issue in newspapers, on social media, everywhere. We wanted harassment to become to gain the visibility of the general and severe issue that it is. Who did we have against us? There were some employers who advocated against more red tape. This is how they phrased their opposition. And surprisingly, the Ministry of National Defense, which was actually not an entity that we had mapped before, because it's not the first thing that you're thinking of as an institution when you want to deal with harassment. But there was a position from the Ministry of National Defense, because the convention, as you have seen at the beginning, had provisions that talked about gender based violence and harassment, and they had an issue with the word gender. In Romania and at the global level, really there is a strong anti-gender movement that is undermining this idea that many of the forms of violence and harassment and abuse and inequality that we're seeing in the world has to do with the social way in which we understand people's place in society based on their gender. It's not something that is innate, it's something that is perpetuated by a patriarchal system that is placing women and gender diverse people in inferiority. And the Ministry of National Defense in the interministerial dialogues was opposing the ratification of the convention because of this term. This at the beginning. Lesson number, I think this is number 4, if I'm getting my count right. The answer to social change is collective power. And it's important, what we had to do was to make harassment in the world of work everyone's issue. We started to bring together over 40 organizations that worked on rule of law, that worked on students' rights, that worked on women's rights, that worked on whistleblowers, and that represented employers' perspectives, because there are employers that do not see tackling harassment as more red tape, but as the genuine responsibility that they have and the smart thing to do in order to ensure that their workplace is safe, and this also leads to productivity and so on. So we created this informal coalition of over 40 organizations that came together, and in all our public communications we spoke with one voice. In all our letters to the Parliament, to the Ministry of Labour, with the members of Parliament, in all of our interviews with media, we highlighted that it's not just one or two civil society organizations that demand this. It is really something that there are many organizations that are concerned about this issue, and they know what the solution is. And ultimately, this led to having 3 years after we initiated this campaign. It was a bit delayed because of the pandemic and also because of the start of the war with Ukraine, where the priorities of the government had shifted. After 3 years, we managed to have the first meeting with the Minister of Labor. By then, it was not a he anymore, it was a she, and the leaders of other national human rights institutions, and to gain the buy-in at the highest level. In order to make sure that this remains on the agenda, we made sure that we put pressure on the ministry from all directions. It was not just from bottom up, from the civil society, but also we wanted to go top down from international and European institutions that we knew that the government would have to engage with. That meant that when Romania lost a case on sexual harassment in the world of work at the European Court of Human Rights in 2022, we engaged with the Council of Europe bodies that monitor the implementation of this judgment and with the government of Romania, asking for Romania to make sure that such cases would not repeat by ratifying the conventions and implementing its provisions. Then we engaged with the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls, which in 2019 had visited Romania and had recommended since then the ratification of the ILO Convention. So we followed up with this UN body as well. Which ultimately led in March 2024 for the president of Romania to promulgate the law that the government has proposed and the parliament had adopted to ratify the convention. There is a lot of unseen work of really unpacking how legislative process works. And regardless on what issue you are dealing on what level, it's very important to really understand how decisions are made, not just who the decision maker is and who the decision maker or makers listen to, but also what's the process. And really exploit all of the windows of opportunities that you have there. We could have stopped in March 2024 because we had achieved what we wanted for Romania to ratify the convention. And it was a big win, but we knew that it was just the first win. We didn't stop there. We then continued to engage and press on the Ministry of Labor to create an intergovernmental working group where civil society organizations and representatives of trade unions as well as employers come together and see how the law has to be amended in order for it to align with the standards of the convention. And that's a process that we successfully started, and it lasted 1 year of meetings, sometimes every week, sometimes every 2 other weeks over the summer, to come with amendments to the various pieces of legislation that spoke to this issue. And now I'm happy to report that the ministry has put everything together, and we're expecting for these amendments to be introduced in Parliament the next parliamentary session in autumn. This is something that we are still advocating for in order to make sure that this doesn't slip off their radar, because with everything that's going on nationally and in the world, it's very easy for something like harassment to not remain on the top of the agenda. I want to stop for 2 minutes, and I will stop then after this, just to talk a little bit about some principles of advocacy ethics. These are just the key ones. There are more that we can talk about, and happy to answer more questions during the Q&A. But there are a few do's and don'ts that are very important to be followed. The first one is to be transparent and honest about what your goals and methods are and what your sources of information. Transparency is important. How you are influencing legislative processes has to be done in a lawful and honest way. And not just when you're engaging with Parliament, but also even if you just want to change a policy in your university, for example. This also helps you to build integrity and for the stakeholders to engage with you in a trustful way. To gain trust is something that doesn't come like this. It's a lot of work to make sure that those stakeholders engage with you in a way that is beyond respectful. They respect your opinions. It's important to respect the stakeholders, everyone that you engage with, even if they may have different opinions to the gravity of the problem which is problematic, but sometimes with the solutions that you propose. Even if we all agreed that harassment in the world of work was an issue, sometimes the solutions that employers had were very different to the solutions that trade unions and civil society organizations were proposing. And there were a lot of heated debates, but always in a respectful manner. If you're losing respect for each other, you're getting at barriers in communication, and things will not advance. Avoid conflicts of interest. Don't do anything that might compromise your objectivity or integrity. Focus on the public good. Advocacy should be directed to policy changes that benefit the society at large or a group at large, not something that advances one's narrow self-interest. It's very important to use evidence-based information. Make sure that the data you are collecting and you're generating is accurate. In a sea of misinformation, make sure that you don't inadvertently contribute to it. Use accurate data and only disseminate information that is reliable, verifiable, and up to date. It's not just an ethical issue, it's also the smart thing to do. The identification of the problem and of your solutions have to start from a very well done analysis. And finally, don't use any undue influence on decision makers. Convince them to the power of your arguments and through by navigating the decision-making process that there is, using that information creatively, but intimidation and other sorts of coercion or manipulation have no place in an ethical advocacy campaign. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pass it back to Alexandra and Bianca to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you so much. Really, I think we've all learned a lot, and thank you so much for describing everything. It's really amazing. So for the Q&A, no one has written any questions in the actual Q&A, but it's not too late. If anyone still wants to put any questions down, we do have like a few minutes for the Q&A specifically. So if you have any questions about what Georgiana talked about or other things you are curious about regarding advocacy, this is your time.
I can share one question that I often get from students or younger audience that I talk to about this campaign, and they often ask me whether it like the students joined our efforts, and the answer is yes. In Romania, the National Students' Council and the students' associations were very eager to get involved in this because they knew that the younger workers, be them interns or volunteers or apprentices, are oftentimes at higher risk of harassment and have less there's a lesser likelihood of them contesting that harassment because they know that they would need that letter of recommendations from their supervisor, and they do not want to make a fuss about it. There are so many layers of power inequality and dynamics that dictate how we react in the face of abuse or injustice. And it's so important for things like policies on harassment to take that into account. So students and pupils were very much keen to be part of this collective voice for stronger anti-harassment legislation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's also great. It's really so nice considering we're all quite young here. Like it's really nice to see how much we can really be a part of such a significant movement. Um, So in terms of questions, the first one that we received is simply put, how to be a better advocate.
I think I already gave away some of my big tips. It's not just my tips; it's really the fundamentals. You really need to understand the issue that you're trying to solve, and to come up with a solution, and to come up with convincing arguments that the solution you're proposing is the most effective one. You are a better advocate when you're not doing this alone, and you're building a larger spectrum of allies. And the best advocates are the best communicators, actually. And you'd be surprised to know that many advocacy organizations, a large part of their budgets actually go into communication. Be that through social media, through op-eds, through interviews, blogs, podcasts, written communication, making sure that you have the best presentation when you meet your target audience, decision makers. The best advocates are the best communicators and the best storytellers. You're a better communicator when you touch someone's heart and soul, not just their brain.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that aspect of storytelling. I think it's talked about more and more, and probably there could be a whole webinar just on storytelling and advocacy. So yeah, thank you for that. And then Zoe is asking, what is your recommendation to involve men in the process to build a diverse allyship to collectively advocate? Because Zoe says, I am of the belief that women's rights and issues that affect women are not the sole responsibility of women and girls, so I expect men to be also a part of this.
That's really a great question, and this was something that we really were quite intentional about from the very beginning. Although our main concern as a women's rights organization was to tackle gender-based harassment and violence in the world of work, because this disproportionately affected women. We didn't want it to make it a women's issue, because otherwise we would have remained just with the women's rights groups advocating for the ratification of the convention, and it wouldn't, our demands wouldn't have been so strong. And that's why the way in which we crafted our messages and our demands was really to reveal that the issue of harassment and violence in the world of work affects everyone, and it is everyone's issue. In the context of Romania, that meant engaging with the unions, the trade unions, which are heavily led by men, oftentimes from the older generation. It was an mini advocacy process in itself to make them understand just how problematic gender-based harassment in the world of work is, to make them understand that it is indeed female workers that are disproportionately affected by this, although they may not hear it. It was one of our wins to make sure that these men started to be the champions for this cause that they should be, and that in an ideal world we didn't have to convince them in the first place, that we would have joined forces, because there would have been movement on that side already. The other thing that we did was to also insist in many of these discussions on bystander intervention. This also goes into policy and training of employers and employees and so on. But it's not just about policies that stop harassment. It is how humans on a day-to-day level interact, and how abusive behavior is contested by everyone, even if like we're seeing sexual harassment, even if men hear about it, not treating it as something natural or as a joke, like stopping it and stopping this culture that perpetuates thinking about what is normal in the workplace. There is a lot of work to do to this area of cultural shift, and that's where we need men on this side, and of course all of the men in parliament, because in Romania it was in all of this decision making fora, it is men who are overrepresented.
Thank you. And I think considering the time, I'll take just one more question, and then we'll move on to the exercise. So another question is that considering that your lesson number one was to be nimble in advocacy, so when you had to shift your approach to put pressure on the influencers of the Ministry of Health, such as the CES and CNDC, etc., how long did that take in order for it to eventually get to the Ministry of Health? And then what's your advice on realistic timelines and also maintaining morale?
That's also a very good question, because it did take time. We figured it out quite quickly, about 6 months into the campaign, that all of the research that we put out there and we sent, and all the letters we had sent to stakeholders, and the meetings that we had were not getting any traction. So about 6 months into the campaign, we started looking at the statute of these national human rights institutions and seeing what their responsibilities are, and using that statute, which is their law, and oftentimes it's enshrined in law because they're public bodies. We used that and demanded them to come up with recommendations on ratifying the convention, and it varied. Some of them came up with recommendations in 2 or 3 months. Most of them did, actually. The ombudsperson report, which was a 70-page, it's not what we asked for. We didn't ask for a report, we already had the data. But the ombudsperson's special report on violence and harassment in the world of work was released a year and a bit after we had submitted that request. What we did was not to wait for all of these institutions to send the recommendations, or just to, some of them send them just to us, which was also interesting, because it's not us who have the power to ratify the convention, right? And by statute they should send those recommendations to the Ministry of Labor, but that's not how there was a discussion with many of them about that as well. So our strategy was to make it public by the time each of them came out, and to keep the momentum, and to have these building blocks whereby the authorities that we were targeting always had this on their radar. And the truth is that the thing that made it all tick was a change in the Prime Minister's cabinet team of counselors. There was a new counselor that came from the trade union sector. We had not known each other before, but once she came in there, we knew that, on a philosophical level at least, we would have an ally in her. And so it was. When she saw that we had all of these reports and recommendations from all of these national human rights institutions, she said, I don't need anything else. Like, you've done all of the groundwork. Now I can use my role to make the Prime Minister communicate with the Ministry of Labor and have this, all started. And once that happened, it was a matter of months that it was ratified. So I guess another lesson is to always watch out at the at the political context and see how people move. Sometimes you invest a lot of time in getting one or two people in position of power on your side, and then they leave that team or they start, focusing on other things. It's so important to always be to be in the loop on these things.
Thank you so much. I think we'll keep it at that and slowly move towards the exercise. We're trying to figure out now because there's usually a chat, and we were thinking because for the exercise we need to send you all a second link, so it can actually be a normal meeting rather than a webinar, and we can actually, interact better.
Okay, if you can open the Q&A session, I put the link to, if you can see it, I put a link to Zoe's question with lesson number 1. I answered it.
Yeah. So
Does it show for you?
Yeah, I see it. So we tried our best with without the chat. So if you just go within the Q&A, you have the open questions and the answered ones. So I hope you see it. If you don't see anything, please write a question in the Q&A, just so you know, just so we know. And then, or if someone could actually just confirm with a yes on the Q&A, so we just see that, the attendees have received the link. That would be great. Okay, thank you, Zoe. We appreciate it. Okay, so now we will close this webinar. We will move towards the second part of the session, move to the exercise. So please go on this link. We will meet you there, and yeah, we'll be actually able to chat. So that's great. Okay. Yeah.
See you on the other side.
See you.
See you.